October 31st, 2002. Biography with Harry Smith.
Stephen King. His novels tap into our greatest fears, inspiring sleepless nights the world over. Before Stephen King was a writer, he was a reader. He cites Richard Matheson's I Am Legend as the book that hooked him on horror. Today, it seems King writes with the same speed he once read. His novel, From a Buick 8, arrived in stores last month, and 2 more volumes of the Dark Tower series are scheduled to be published within the next year. What better night than Halloween to examine the life of a man who has taken such pleasure in scaring the daylights out of so many of us.
Stephen King is, to a large number of people, synonymous with horror.
We all have these fears and these terrors, and he was able to touch them within ourselves in a way that had never been done before.
What made Steve different from the beginning was that he not only aspired to be a writer, he just went ahead and did it.
He's a real basic kind of guy. He likes his jeans, he likes his Harley, he likes his truck.
He was severely injured, I think probably more seriously than the press was aware of.
What you have is a body of work that literally has not been out of print, any of his books, since Carrie, which is a tremendous achievement for any writer.
The movie The Green Mile is based on a serialized story written by Stephen King. Incredibly, this is the 48th movie produced by Hollywood from his writings. Most people know Stephen King through the movies, as the writer responsible for horror classics such as The Shining and Carrie. But he's also the writer that penned Academy Award-winning films like Misery, and critically acclaimed movies like The Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me, and Dolores Claiborne. King is so prolific he is the most read, most successful writer of this century. Writing has made him rich and powerful, a far cry from the life he grew up in. In the late 1940s, Maine was a poor, rural, sparsely populated state. Most people struggled hard to make a living. Among them was Donald Edwin King. After serving in the Merchant Marines during the war, he found work in Maine selling vacuum cleaners door to door. In 1947, he and his wife Ruth Pillsbury King were raising their adopted 2-year-old David in Portland. Years earlier, doctors had informed Ruth that she would never bear children. But that year, she proved them wrong. Much to her surprise, she discovered she was pregnant. And on September 21st at Maine General Hospital, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, the King's second and only natural-born child, Stephen Edwin King. The Kings welcomed their new addition and settled back into their lives. Typical for most families at the time, Ruth was the homemaker, tending to the children, and Donald was the breadwinner, until 1950, when Donald changed the Kings' lives forever.
He said, "Ruth, I'm going to go out and get a pack of cigarettes." And that was the last she ever saw of him.
Ruth was abandoned, along with 2-year-old Stephen and 4-year-old David. For the next 9 years, they traveled around the country, from the East Coast to the Midwest and back again. Sometimes they stayed with Ruth's family, sometimes with Donald's. Ruth always hoping that somewhere her husband would return.
I think what I remember most about our mom was that she was a worker. And that has certainly influenced the both of us. I don't think anyone could ever say Steve and I are lazy. The other thing I think that came from our mom was persistence.
She often worked 2 or 3 jobs at once just to pay their way and keep her small family afloat. There were times when Ruth couldn't even afford babysitters and had to leave her small boys alone while she worked.
I understood that David used to read to Stephen and then get Stephen to read to him, and that's how they took care of each other. And she'd come home and ask him questions to make sure that they had focused on reading while she was gone. But at that time, they would have been like 4, 5, 6, very young.
Stephen and David thrived on a steady diet of words, especially mystery stories and early horror comic books like EC Comics. One of Stephen's favorite books was the horror classic, Dracula. In 1958, Ruth moved back to Durham, Maine. She struck a bargain with her family. She would tend to her ailing parents, and in return, her sister Etheline gave them a house to live in. Ruth was paid in goods, groceries, and clothing, and occasionally she worked part-time to make extra money. Even by Durham standards, the Kings were exceptionally poor. Their house had no indoor plumbing, and in the cold Maine winters, Stephen and his brother walked to their aunt's house for a hot bath. The way Ruth King dealt with their circumstances, with a sense of humor and the instincts of a storyteller, would have a lasting influence on Stephen.
She worked at Pineland, which was for the mentally handicapped. To make the job livable, or to be able, you had to have a little bit of humor about some things that maybe aren't really particularly humorous.
In 1959, David and Stephen combined their love of words with the self-reliance they'd learned from their mother. 13-year-old David found an old mimeograph machine and started a local newsletter, Dave's Rag, which sold for a nickel. Stephen contributed reviews of television shows and short stories. The King boys may have been the poorest kids in town, but they were hard to ignore.
Dave was so ambitious in doing everything, and Steve was the reader. He was kind of a big, goofy kid. He'd be walking down the road, and he'd always be reading his book, and he'd just always worry if he was going to make it down the road.
At age 11, Stephen was over 6 feet tall, awkward, uncoordinated, and severely myopic. But he was admired by his school friends at Durham Elementary for how well read he was.
Our family were readers, all three of us. And when we were living in Durham, I can remember especially, if you came in at supper time, you'd see the three of us seated around the table, each of us reading our own paperback.
Stephen King's world revolved around books. At home, he lined the walls of his room with paperbacks. And when he made money doing jobs for the neighbors, he would go to Lisbon Falls to indulge his second favorite pastime, watching B sci-fi and horror movies.
He thrived on horror magazines and horror movies. Every movie that we ever went to was usually a horror movie. He loved to be scared. I think, or proving that he couldn't be scared.
Right, proving he could be scared, right. That was good.
When he couldn't afford to go out, Stephen would visit with his friends and stay up late watching Mexican horror movies and The Twilight Zone on television, always maintaining that all the monsters, ghouls, and vampires that made his friends scream never scared him. Stephen, in fact, had a long list of fears: spiders, closed-in spaces, sewers, funerals, the number 13, the dark. But more than anything, though, Stephen feared what he saw as the very thin line between good and evil.
On June 25th, 1959...
When he was just 11, he began collecting stories about a real-life mass murderer, Charlie Starkweather, who'd gone on a killing spree with his girlfriend in Nebraska and Wyoming. Stephen dealt with his fears by writing them down. In 1960, Stephen discovered that his love of writing may have been no accident. He stumbled upon a box in his aunt's attic, and much to his surprise, he discovered that his long-gone father was an aspiring writer with a stack of rejection slips from magazines.
And the letters suggested that he had a lot of talent and asked him to resubmit other stories. And I asked my mother about that one time because she'd kept all his stuff, and she just kind of laughed and said, "Stephen, your father didn't have any persistence. That's why he left the marriage."
Stephen began submitting his own stories to magazines, and he started his own collection of rejection slips. But unlike his father, Stephen didn't stop writing. He was determined to persevere until he was published. In the fall, Stephen began attending Lisbon High School, where he gained notoriety and a 3-day suspension for publishing a parody of the high school newspaper called The Village Vomit. He also taught himself the guitar and formed a band. But unlike most teenagers, he had a part-time job, digging graves. The job inspired Stephen's short story, I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, a tale about an orphan boy who accepts a job digging up bodies for a mad scientist. And in 1965, Comics Review accepted the story and published it. He received no money, but he was finally in print. Stephen did well enough in high school so that he was offered a partial scholarship to Drew University, a New Jersey Methodist college. But his mother couldn't afford to send him. So in 1966, he followed in his brother's footsteps and attended the University of Maine at Orono. On campus, Stephen was not hard to miss, a huge, badly dressed, bearded, long-haired man.
I became aware of him as a presence in the class very early on. He was very forceful and vocal. He spoke up in class. He had very perceptive things to say.
And one area that Stephen became very vocal in was the anti-Vietnam War movement. His protest took the form of writing a regular column in the campus newspaper called King's Garbage Truck. Besides the 47 columns he wrote, King published a serialized comic western called Slade and wrote novels.
We have many students who aspire to be writers, but what made Steve different from the beginning was that he not only aspired to be a writer, he just went ahead and did it.
As a junior in college, I remember he had 5 novels completed. So he was a very prolific writer.
And in 1966, his freshman year, he received his first check, $35 from Startling Mystery Stories, for his short story, The Glass Floor. He wrote constantly, but his writing wasn't earning him a living. He was still desperately poor. To supplement the $5 a week his mother sent him, Stephen took a part-time job in the university library. In the stacks, he met Tabitha Spruce, a history major and aspiring poet.
He really was literally the poorest college student I've ever met in my life. And he was wearing, at that point in his life, cut-off gum rubbers because he couldn't afford shoes.
Tabitha was the third of 8 children from a working-class family in Old Town Bangor. The two shared a love of books and writing.
We fell in love. We had a kid, and then we got married, because that's the way it was done sometimes in the 60s.
They named their first child, a girl, Naomi. In January 1971, just after Stephen graduated, they were married. The family moved into a trailer in Herman, Maine, just outside Bangor. King had expected to find teaching work, but had not been lucky. Instead, he pumped gas for minimum wage and worked at a commercial laundry in Bangor for $1.60 an hour. Tabitha went to work at Dunkin' Donuts at night.
If I had moments when I was working at New Franklin Laundry in Bangor when I felt depressed or downhearted, it was when I thought, all I've managed to do with my college education is to replicate my mother's life.
What little time Stephen had after working all day and then playing father was spent at the typewriter. This, he felt, would be his ticket out of poverty. Finally, in the fall of 1971, Stephen landed a job as an English teacher at the Hamden Academy. His income would be about $4,600 a year. It was respectable, but it was also his personal nightmare. He would earn enough money to get by, but live a life as a frustrated writer. Even in his wildest dreams, Stephen King couldn't have imagined how different his life was going to be. In early 1972, Stephen King was a 24-year-old college graduate working as an English teacher and struggling to make ends meet. He was married with a 3-year-old daughter, and his wife Tabitha was expecting again. Their home was a rented trailer. Times were so lean that the Kings periodically asked the phone company to disconnect their service because they couldn't pay their bills. Stephen and Tabitha's second child, Joseph, was born on June 4th, 1972. That summer, Stephen went back to work in an industrial laundry to supplement his income as a teacher. During the fall, he taught all day, came home, marked papers, and then prepared lessons before retiring to the trailer's furnace room to write. For at least 2 hours a night, Stephen sat in the cramped space, balancing a typewriter on a child's desk on his lap, banging out stories. He soon developed a clientele for his work, men's magazines like Cavalier, Dude, Gent, and Swank.
I wanted to send my mother some of these stories that I'd published, but I ran them through the Xerox machine at the library at the University of Maine because they had all these ads, you know, like dial 1-800-JUGS and stuff like that on the side, and so I didn't necessarily want her to see that.
Stephen was making around $200 a story. That money went out the minute it came in. Often it would arrive just in time to cover the latest emergency.
For rent, for the double-wide trailer that they had, for medicine for the kids. It was always one emergency after another, as it is when you're newlyweds and you've got kids and there's more bills than there is money.
Stephen wrote stories as fast as he could, but as his financial responsibilities mounted, it was hard for him to imagine he'd ever break the cycle of just making enough to survive. His frustration sometimes led him to the local bar or to the poker table, where he'd spend a night smoking cigarettes and gambling with his buddies. That in turn would cause more stress at home.
I think I was more angry at the $5 that went out every week for the carton of cigarettes than I was anything else. It was the literal burning of money that drove me nuts.
Books had always been Stephen's refuge. He was used to getting lost in them. Now he had to face the fact that he could not afford even those.
We would sometimes fight about his buying a hardcover book because those two were also very expensive on that kind of a budget.
Just when it looked like things were getting really bleak, Stephen realized he'd made a valuable friend. Bill Thompson, a veteran Doubleday editor, had accepted and read 3 of his manuscripts, but he couldn't convince Doubleday to publish them.
So I hadn't heard from him in a while, and somebody had just given me a country music calendar. And so I mailed it on to him. And I said, do you realize your birthday is the same as A.J. Carter of the Carter family, you know, and why haven't I heard from you? I don't want to see you on the Simon & Schuster list.
Stephen was working on a short story he was hoping to sell to Cavalier, a girly magazine, for a few $100s. It was about Carrietta White, the backward daughter of a religious fanatic, the ultimate teenage outsider. But King thought he didn't know enough about teenage girls to be true to the character, so he tossed it.
He put it in the trash can. He put the first part of it in the trash can, and as I was emptying the can, I picked it up and noticed it was a fairly significant block of writing, so I read it.
Stephen still thought it was a loser, but at Tabitha's insistence, he finished it and sent it to Bill.
And it was this novel, Carrie. And I thought, now this one has legs to it. This one we can really do something with. So I said, I hate to ask you to do this. Would you please do some rewrite on this? And we'll really go for it. I'll go to the wall on this one.
Stephen made the changes, resubmitted the manuscript, and went back to worrying about paying the bills. Once again, the Kings asked the phone company to disconnect their phone.
And one day when I was in the teacher's room, the loudspeaker came on and said, Mr. King, will you come to the office? You have a call from your wife. And I hurried up to the office with my heart going 100 miles an hour in my chest, because I thought to myself, one of two things has happened. Either the baby something's wrong with the baby, or I've sold the book. And she had had a telegram from Bill Thompson. He had to send a telegram because he couldn't call. We had no phone. And the telegram said, Carrie officially a Doubleday book. The future lies ahead. Love, Bill Thompson. And it said as a P.S., $2,500 okay, question mark. $2,500 was very okay. It seemed like a fortune to us.
Doubleday would release Carrie in April of 1974. Stephen and Tabitha moved to an apartment in Bangor, Maine, and got a phone installed. Stephen even toyed with the idea of quitting teaching, but he had no illusions about the book business. He didn't think he could depend on it to make a living. What he didn't know was that the Doubleday subsidiary rights department was talking to New American Library, a paperback book publisher. They also found the story of Carrietta White very appealing.
I think their first offer was either $200,000 or $250,000 for the paperback rights on this. Well, this just blew us all out of the water. And, you know, Bob Banker, who was our subsidiary rights man, you know, great poker player, you know. Well, actually, we were looking for more than that.
And I say to Bill, how much? And he said, 6 figures, $400,000. The phone was on the wall in the kitchen, and all the strength ran out of my legs, and I just kind of slid down the wall. I can remember my shirt tail coming out of my pants until my butt was on the linoleum.
At the time, Doubleday's policy was to split the money from paperback sales evenly with the author. Stephen would get $200,000, enough for him to quit teaching and write full-time. But one of the people who mattered the most to Stephen never took part in his success. His mother had seen the manuscript of Carrie, and she knew that Doubleday would publish it, but she never saw the book. In December 1973, after a long, painful battle with lung cancer, Ruth King died. She was 59 years old.
You know, here he had finally hit the big time, and his mother had just seen a glimpse of it, and he'd wished, you know, that she just could have lived long to
Stephen was devastated, especially when he learned after his mother's death that the $5 a week she'd sent him in college often meant she'd gone without food. But he also realized that he had gotten much more from her. Ruth worked hard and persevered, and those same qualities had gotten him off the ground. But Stephen had to wrestle with another demon. Would he be just a one-book wonder? In 1973, 26-year-old Stephen King received a $200,000 advance for the paperback rights for his first novel, Carrie, a book that he'd originally thrown into the trash. The money turned him from struggling high school English teacher to published author, with enough money to quit his job and do what he'd been dreaming about since he was 11 years old, write full-time. It also allowed him for the first time in his life to indulge himself.
I remember as an undergraduate he would talk about when he sold his first novel he was going to buy I believe it was a pink Cadillac convertible, and come back to campus with his big car and sort of drive around.
King decided against the pink Cadillac. Instead, he bought a red, white, and blue one, though he was still humble enough to ditch it when he went back home to visit his friends in Durham.
And he drove this like 64 Dodge Dart, all rusted out, ugliest looking car you ever saw. And he said, you know, he just was a little embarrassed coming back home driving that great big red, white, and blue Cadillac. So he drove this $100 car.
The money didn't change Stephen all that much. He was still modest, and he was still afraid that he'd never really be a successful writer. Carrie, he thought, might be a fluke. He didn't know if he was just a one-book wonder.
This is not a dumb man, and I think he felt, I got it, but I can also go away. I'm going to enjoy it while it's here.
Stephen wrote constantly, churning out 1,500 words a day. His inspirations came from the people he met, incidences in his own life, and the day-to-day life in rural Maine. His next book, Salem's Lot, was a story about Dracula set in a small town in Maine. He sent the manuscript off to Doubleday. They bought the book and sold the paperback rights for $500,000. Again, Stephen got half. His first two novels had made him almost $500,000, phenomenal for a new writer, and there was the promise of more money from the movies. With the success of Rosemary's Baby, horror was hot in Hollywood, and Columbia Pictures optioned his first book, Carrie. But King couldn't shake the fear that he'd ultimately fail at what he wanted so badly. He thought a change of scene might inspire more books, and for the first time in his life, he had the financial freedom to leave Maine. In the fall of 1974, the Kings climbed into their new Cadillac and drove to Boulder, Colorado. In Boulder, Stephen had a hard time focusing on work. He started one story after another, but nothing clicked. Thinking a few days off might help, he asked the locals where he and Tabitha and the children could spend a quiet weekend. They recommended the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park.
And they were, in fact, getting ready to shut down for the winter season. They check in, and they practically have the whole hotel to themselves. King's imagination started going into overtime. He would walk down the hall, and he would see a fire hose all coiled up, and in his mind, he could visualize it and hear it thumping on the ground, coming to life.
He began work on the story of a little boy with paranormal powers who is in danger of being overcome by the evil in the haunted Overlook Hotel, and whose life is threatened by his drunken father. But this was not just another horror story. Stephen was writing about his own experiences.
Anybody who's been married 3 or 4 years, who's coping with basically no funds and everything else, there's a lot of stress, interpersonal stress, and a lot of that stuff went into the novel that I wrote, The Shining, that had to do with booze, that had to do with anger, with a lot of the things that I felt at that time.
King finished The Shining in Colorado. Though Boulder had inspired him, Stephen's heart was in the East. He missed New England's small towns. In 1975, he and his family returned to Maine. Stephen's second book, Salem's Lot, was released around Halloween. The paperback quickly followed. It sold well to readers of horror fiction, but late in 1976, a whole new audience discovered Stephen King with the movie release of Carrie. starring Sissy Spacek. It was a box office smash. The film, made for less than $2 million, grossed $30 million in the United States alone. Stephen loved it. He loved what director Brian De Palma had done with the film, and he loved reaching a whole new audience. And with the success of Carrie, Hollywood loved him.
What the film Carrie did was it put King on the map in a way that a book just won't. You want to get people that aren't going to go into the bookstore. These are the non-book readers. You know, a movie like Carrie will get them into the stores.
High sales gave Stephen the confidence to ask Doubleday to publish books that had been rejected before Carrie was released. Stephen was keen to have the first novel he ever wrote, Rage, published. The story was about a student who takes over a school and holds his classmates hostage. But Doubleday didn't want to saturate the market with his name, so he convinced his paperback publishers to release Rage under a pseudonym, Richard Bachman.
Rage by Richard Bachman came and sank like a stone. I mean, the world was not looking for a Richard Bachman book. And I think he was somewhat disappointed by that.
But they were looking for the next Stephen King book, and in 1977, Doubleday published The Shining. 50,000 hardcover books were sold, and Stephen was in a whole new league. It was his first hardback bestseller. The paperback went on to sell almost 2.5 million copies. Stephen King's first 3 books were all bestsellers, but with his 4th book, The Stand, released in 1978, King produced his masterpiece.
This book here is probably everybody's favorite, the one they strive to get. It sells in excess of $1,200 now.
The Stand is, in terms of King's fiction, it's unique. Here's a man who can write characters, large and small, much like a Dickens landscape.
The Stand is an apocalyptic novel about a superflu that kills most of the population. The survivors are engaged in a battle of good against evil. The original manuscript was 1,200 pages long and weighed in at 12.5 pounds. Doubleday refused to release it before Stephen trimmed 400 pages. Stephen had made millions for Doubleday. He felt like he had the right to call his own shots, but they insisted. To make matters worse, because of an earlier contract which doled out money in small yearly increments, he wasn't even seeing his share of the profits. But what sent Stephen over the top was the way the executives at Doubleday treated their #1 author.
Every time he came to New York to meet me or to, go over a manuscript, whatever it was, it seemed that every time that I was walking the halls with him and some of the brass would go by, they never once recognized him. I'd have to introduce him again.
In 1978, he quit Doubleday and negotiated a deal with New American Library, his paperback book publishers. They gave him a $2.5 million advance for 3 books. He'd come a long way from the writer who just 7 years before had wept with joy at his $2,500 advance for Carrie. He would never again be a struggling writer. He had money and fame. But soon, he'd learn that his good fortune came at a price. In 1978, 31-year-old Stephen King was the hottest new writer in America. His first 4 books had made him a millionaire. Now Stephen, his wife Tabitha, and their 3 children could live anywhere, but they chose to stay close to home in Maine. They rented a house outside Bangor in Orrington on a busy road that they soon discovered was treacherous. In fact, so many animals were killed by speeding trucks that they had their own burial ground, the woods behind Stephen's backyard.
One of the kids would have his wagon, put the body in the wagon, wheel it here, everything, high ceremony, wheel it here, dig little graves, bury them, make markers, then they'd sit and have a little after-burial party.
When Stephen's cat, Smucky, was killed, it too was buried in the animal resting place. And then the Kings had a brush with every parent's worst nightmare. Their youngest child was almost killed on the road. Like many of Stephen's worst fears, it became a novel, Pet Sematary, the story of a father who brings his child back from the dead and must live with the consequences.
And of course in the book the 2-year-old is killed on the road, and I found that very, very hard to read and deal with.
Stephen, a devoted father, was terrified by what he had written. He put the manuscript in a drawer for 3 years and left it. He began writing another book, The Dead Zone, a book based on his anxiety about how to deal with his extraordinary talents and the problems they brought him. As King became more popular, his fans became more persistent, sometimes showing up at his home to ask for money. Stephen found it more and more difficult to guard his privacy.
I once said to him that I thought The Dead Zone was an autobiographical novel. The situation in The Dead Zone where you have this person with this gift that, in a sense, makes life very difficult for him because everybody wants a kind of piece of the gift.
Do you know me? It's frightening how many novels of suspense I've written.
That included commercial advertisers and Hollywood studios. His books were optioned for movies almost as quickly as they were written. In 1979, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining was released.
King loves movies, and King sees movies a lot, and of course when Kubrick's name came up he was initially very enthusiastic because he was familiar with Kubrick's body of work and he had great expectations.
The movie was a box office sensation, one of Warner Brothers' top-grossing films of all time. King thought the movie was visually stunning and scary, but Kubrick had ignored an important theme in the book, the disintegration of the family.
Kubrick kind of dismisses the genuine subtext of the book and instead kind of creates his own story based on Jack being nuts, but it doesn't tell the story the way he wrote it.
King wielded his considerable clout and demanded that from then on he would have a say in who directed his stories. He distrusted Hollywood and wanted to keep his distance from the star scene. He also needed privacy, even security, from his ever-persistent fans. In 1980, he bought a Victorian mansion in Bangor, Maine. It took craftsmen 3 years to renovate the 126-year-old house. The boy who'd grown up with no indoor plumbing now had a 47-foot indoor swimming pool. And in true Stephen King style, there are bats outside and inside the house.
When we have bats in the house, which we do get because it's an old house, I'm the one who's in charge of bat control. I capture the bat and put it out, and he just screams and runs away. No.
Comfortable in his privacy with his family, King's writing output exploded. Between 1980 and 1984, he published 14 novels, and they were just the tip of the iceberg. He also wrote poetry, plays, original screenplays, and short stories. Some of King's work, like The Shining, was now being taught as part of college courses.
Of how evil presents itself to us.
But not everyone admired him. Literary critics generally ripped apart his writing, saying he was a hack. He just churned out books for money. What was worse, as far as Stephen was concerned, was that a growing number of school libraries were banning his books. The furor increased when a series of school shootings were reportedly inspired by King's novel Rage, published under his now revealed pseudonym, Richard Bachman.
If there's anything that I regret in my career, it's publishing the novel Rage. Several kids have killed teachers or held classes hostage who apparently had read that book, read it recently, and in some cases, one kid in Lexington, Kentucky had read the book several times.
But King would not apologize for the rest of his work. In fact, he is a vocal supporter of free speech. And in 1986, he helped spearhead a campaign against banning books at a rally held in Virginia Beach. That same year, Stephen emerged as more than the king of horror. One of his short stories, The Body, was released as the movie Stand By Me, directed by Rob Reiner.
Look over there! I see him! I see him!
None of us could breathe. Somewhere under those bushes was the rest of Ray Brower.
The coming-of-age story, set in Maine, was based on a true incident from Stephen's childhood, and the four young boys were composite sketches of his childhood friends from Durham. When Stephen saw the film, it evoked emotional memories.
And when the movie was over, he said, look, you got to give me some time. I can't talk now. And we went outside for about 20 minutes, and he just sat inside by himself. And it took him that long to recover because it was a very painful, very painful experience for him to have to relive that time.
By the end of the 1980s, Stephen King had sold over 100 million books. He was one of the most powerful men in publishing and in Hollywood. The self-described hick from Maine ran an empire that included movies, books, television series, CDs, and audiobooks.
By then, he was having a hard time keeping her from leaping back across the room and grabbing David.
His rags to riches story was like something out of a Hollywood movie. Unlike the fiction he wrote, it looked like he was headed for a happy ending. Until one fateful day in June 1999. By the late 1980s, Stephen King wielded considerable clout in both the literary world and in Hollywood. He had published more than 30 books, 16 of which had been made into movies. The inspiration for many of these books came from small towns in Maine. Maine had been good to him. He was now able to be good to Maine. In Bangor, there was no suitable field for Little League baseball. His youngest son, Owen, was a good pitcher. And Stephen, a lifelong baseball fan, decided it was time to step up to the plate.
When he came up with the idea of the Little League field here in Bangor, it was all out of his pocket, and it was all out of the fact that he wanted the kids to have something that they could play on that was a decent field.
Nor did Stephen forget the importance of the public library in his formation as a writer. With his wife Tabitha as chairperson, they spearheaded a drive to raise funds to expand the local Bangor library. He even put his boyhood dream of becoming a rock star to good use. He bought the local rock station, WZON, to ensure its survival.
On rhythm guitar, Stephen King.
And he and other writers, including columnist Dave Barry, toured under the name Rock Bottom Remainders to raise money for Literacy for America and other causes.
I think Stephen's biggest fear is that suddenly the entire band will stop and turn to him and go, "Take it!" She never said between you and I. No, no, she never said between you and I.
Singing solos aside, it seemed as if a lot of Stephen's personal demons had been conquered. He'd never need to earn another cent or worry about failure or the inability to be the kind of father and family man he wanted to be. He could write just for the joy of it, and his work was gaining new respect. The 1990 film Misery, based on his 1987 novel, earned 4 Academy Award nominations. Misery portrays an author who had given up the genre he'd been writing in to try something new. Through a twist of fate, he is captured by his self-described #1 fan. A terrifying woman who holds him in a snowbound cabin until he writes one more novel for her.
I'm sorry, Paul. This is all wrong.
What?
You'll have to do it over again. It's not worthy of you. Throw it all out. Except for that part of naming the gravedigger after me. You can leave that in.
I really value your criticism, but maybe we're being a little hasty here.
Overzealous fans are not unknown to Stephen. Despite security, his Bangor home was broken into one night in April 1991, while he was out and Tabitha was alone.
He came in the window and he said, "I have a bomb and I'm going to kill you." And I said, "Oh," and went out the window went out the door, nearest door in my pajamas.
But if celebrity stalkers were the downside of success, Stephen King had weathered celebrity better than others. The public never seems to tire of his stories. Throughout the 1990s, his books continued to be blockbusters and his TV miniseries were hits. And with movies such as Dolores Claiborne and The Shawshank Redemption, he was getting more respect as a serious writer.
There's been a significant shift in the last 10 years. People saw him as a popular and moneyed writer, and now I think many people are seeing him as an important writer.
Smile, you're on America's Most Wanted.
Oh my gosh.
By 1999, King had more than he ever could have dreamed.
Get a picture. What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you? Oh, you're going to put up with that?
Over 300 million copies of his books were in worldwide circulation. He had money, fame, and growing respect. His children had grown up and left home. He and Tabitha were looking forward to a new phase of life. They thought about buying a home in Florida, far from the harsh Maine winters, where they could retire. Then, in June, the man who had made his name in horror became part of a horror story himself. Stephen was hit by a car close to his home in Maine.
He was severely injured, I think probably more seriously than the press was aware of.
Steve almost lost his life. In fact, one of the EMTs that was at the scene told him later that he was surprised that Steve did, in fact, survive the accident.
Stephen sustained injuries to his lungs. He broke his leg, ribs, and fractured his hip. For weeks, he was hospitalized, undergoing numerous operations, losing over 100 pounds from all the surgery. But finally, in late 1999, he was well enough to attend the premiere of a new film based on his story, The Green Mile. Stephen claimed that his biggest nightmare after the accident was that he would not be able to write again. For a man who's devoted his whole life to writing and who is now the most popular writer alive, it would be a tragic end to a remarkable career. But in late 1999, he was back at his desk, pounding out new stories, writing a new chapter in an amazing life story.
You want to know what I'm really afraid of in terms of my work is that I won't know when it's time to stop.
Unless he is mellowing, and because of his age, I think he's always going to write the same kind of book.
Yes, something whispered. Yes, he is.
The one that touches that dark corner of fear in all of us.
And that thought, like so much that had happened to him since his mother...
The work he's done is astonishing, not only in terms of the volume of work, but the kinds of material and the kinds of characters he's created. I think he's one of the great storytellers ever.
His face began to change as David had never...
There's a very strong sense that Stephen King has chronicled the second half of this century in a way that people will want to read it 50 years, 100 years in the future.
As if his mind and body had turned into some sort of pipe. He is in there. I know he is.
An adaptation of Stephen King's novel, Dreamcatcher, is scheduled to hit theaters this February. The film stars Morgan Freeman as a colonel sent to aid 4 men locked in a battle with aliens that control humans like puppets. For more on Stephen King's family tree, log on to genealogy.com.